Hi, everybody. I come from a fairly complex background in terms of my work in public spaces. I actually studied music for most of my life, and I did my original studies in physics. So I'll begin just by laying out some of the parameters that make me think about things that I do. And like any good talk, I should start with a Venn diagram. So if I were to describe the intersection of things that do what I do for me, dynamic systems will come up a lot. These are complex systems that have moving parts. A lot of people have been talking about that from an urban planning and media theory point of view. Narratives and storytelling. I come from the stage performance setting, and that's always a part of me. And building instruments is how I actually found my way out of music and into the visual arts. So I'll mention that word instrument a lot because it's very central. But like any good talk, I'm going to start with an anecdote. And the anecdote is about this guy, Boomsba. He's a scholar in Denmark who studies social insects. And we've been talking a lot about the interconnections in societies and larger groups. And I thought back to this talk that this guy gave that really blew me away. And the setting of the talk was a series of about 15 bullet points of features of societies that you would think are so distinctly human and nothing else. So things like public health, crime and punishment, mercenary defense, mercenary attack. And in this, what I consider a really beautiful literary European way, number 15 in the list was just a grand thing called culture. These are all the things that these insects happen to exhibit. And of course, in this beautiful European way, parenthetically in front of culture, it said music, theater, God, religion, all that stuff. And the form of the talk was that one by one he showed how these ants and termites, now the ants and termites turn out to be important because for me, I did a work with them, but these ants and termites actually exhibit a lot of the things that we think of as very human in their own society. So with that, I'll start by telling you about a piece called The Tragedy of the Commons. Martin mentioned this thought problem yesterday also. Keith Garrett in 1956 wrote a paper called The Tragedy of Commons, and I think people know this story. The story is that if there's a public space, there's going to be a lot of forces on this public space that at some point might motivate us to actually take your commons and make it private so that you can, quote unquote, make it fair. So in this piece, we took a colony of Atta sextens. This is leafcutter ants. You know them from the famous Pixar film called Ants. And we learned all about their husbandry, the whole process of keeping them in these caves as you do. And to tell you just a couple of things about these ants get into societies that are up into the millions. And, I could talk for hours just about these ants, but I'll just tell you about their queen, because these ants, even when their societies are up into the hundreds of thousands, there's one queen. So the entire colony's sexual organ is this one organism that usually lives in the center of the most dense part. And you've seen the pictures, right? These are the ants that create castles underground that we discover in Brazil mostly. And what we did in this piece was we tried to propose to them some options. Because these ants, if you look in the literature, they're very well researched because they're optimizers. So that whole American notion of obsession with efficiency, these ants have really figured out. And oddly enough, in the literature, the place where you find these ants applied is in finance. So predicting bankruptcies and whatnot. And what's really beautiful about these ants, of course, is that, they're totally altruistic. So again, thinking of Boomsba's list of human features, when you observe these ants and you work with them, you actually see signs of martyrdom, you see signs of shunning. Every now and then there's an ant that's a freeloader, so they have freeloaders that the rest of the society pulls apart. And here's how our piece worked. In the piece, somehow I have to click in. There we go. So the setting of the piece was that these ants are in their home area. This is where they live in the laboratory, and we work with a lab and we learned how to maintain a colony of 60,000 ants. And then we created an open foraging area for them. So this is the model of the forest. And in this foraging area, there was a ground floor. That's the sound of an ant chewing, by the way. So the musical training that I have always comes back in pieces in the form of sound. And then the second level of this foraging area was a place where the ants had options. So they could either eat some fresh rose petals or they could eat an atlas. They could eat some parafilm or they could eat some leaves. And what you see, especially as the situation becomes dynamic, so you'll see in this diagram there are drawbridges that go up, and so all of a sudden the structure moves and the ants are forced to reorganize and start eating something else. So here it is, and then the structure moves and then it comes down, and what's beautiful about them is that they're super, efficient at what they do, so they eat a pile of leaves this big in about 20 minutes. But what you see also is that optimization is so natural. It's not like they have a moral dilemma of whether they should eat the rose petals or the parafilm, even though they're nutritionally different and whatnot. So Exhibit A. Let's go to Exhibit B. I'm going to step kind of backwards in my history now. In the whole world of instrument building and performance, I'm going to talk about the instrument as, let's say, the thing in between. I borrow that term from Krzysztof Wodiczko, whose projection work is really like monumental for anyone who's done that kind of work, and the bulk of this talk will be about urban projection. If I take myself back to how I got into this kind of rat race of performance, this is a very significant piece for me, and I'll just play it for you so that you get a bit of a sense of my aesthetics in terms of the treatment of time and the treatment of objects that can allow you to communicate something symbolically. So this piece is a 20-minute performance, and if I were to extract some of the ideas that may help you understand my practice, it's a very, very strict mix of improvisation and rehearsed moments. It's very obsessed with timing, rhythmic timing, so the notion of gesture as a communicative element is really important. And it's very obsessed also with formal symbolism of objects. So if I could use a quote from Maurice Urkagel, who's a composer from the 50s who really brought musical theater and contemporary music together. If you give me a table and a dry sponge and a few minutes, you can create form. And that way of dealing with events over time to generate meaning has always been really interesting for me. And now maybe the third part of my whole world is that though I started in music, at some point I got this job in a university, and when I got that job, they looked at my portfolio and they said, well, your degree's in music, but all this stuff that you make is like big and heavy, so do you want to be in art or do you want to be in music? And as of 5-6 years ago, I started to find myself more and more in art practice on the side of sculpture, and maybe the area that I'm trying to contribute to as much as I can is the whole world of machine manufacturing, machine design, the ethos of sharing, open source, all that stuff. There are a lot of buzzwords with those things, and I think I'll have a lot of time to share those findings with people that are in the masterclass. But suffice it to say that perhaps the most wasteful piece of art that I've ever made is this piece here. We were commissioned by a company in France called Pommery. It's a champagne maker that has something like 17 kilometers of caves in Reims in France underground, and like a good champagne maker, they've turned 2 kilometers of it into an art space. So we decided to deal with this commission, which was in a space that was about 90 meters tall and 50 meters wide. We decided to make a loudspeaker. a giant loudspeaker that was going to amplify the sound of champagne as they poured the champagne ceremoniously into a glass. And at this point, my obsession really was with the whole process of origami as a very scalable fabrication technique. So, we said to ourselves, yeah, it'll be easy. We just designed this folding thing that has 19 layers and 15 pieces around, and there's 6 fold patterns, and we'll build it like this. You'll build it from the top, and you pull it up, and add the next layer, and pull it up. Well, I won't go too far into it, but what a total nightmare. This piece has something like 8,000 pieces of hardware in it, and as you go lower and lower, at some point it becomes much bigger than you, and at the end of it all, this is what it looked like. It was this, giant loudspeaker, and true learning experience for me in that this I really appreciate. So these series of 3 images, I'm sorry that you can't see the middle one, but it's basically like a line vector of the top one. The top one is the rendering. The middle one is the lines, and the bottom one is the reality. That was the photograph. And time again, I've seen, you show this to people, and some people are like, wow, man, congrats. Like, that looks just like the rendering. Amazing. Whereas for me, having worked with ants and bees and all these unknowns that really bring so much excitement to my practice, for me, this turned out to be what a grand waste of time. Why would you spend 30,000 euros and all this man hours just to make something that looks exactly like the rendering? We can come back to that also. So let me now step into the world of MAL. MAL started as a collective at the University of Minnesota, where I was teaching Minneapolis art on wheels, or magic and wizardry, and more art wherever. But the focus here was to take the medium of projection and bring it outdoors, but to try to get rid of all of the obstacles and hindrances and barriers that projection feels outdoors. So right away, our focus was to get rid of the $20,000, $200,000 projectors, forget about the scaffolding that needs union labor, forget about the outlets, and really try to do a lot with very little. And in the process, in order to do a lot with very little, we started to design a series of instruments over the years. So we began with this kind of trike model, which was inspired by Graffiti Research Labs, generator, projector, camera for machine vision, so that you can do these kinds of performances rapidly. We made another version. It was kind of an extended bike model. So this is a bike that's from the Surly manufacturer in Minnesota. It's a big bike town, Minneapolis, so there was a lot of support for this. And again, this allows you to do these kinds of impromptu performances at very large scales by being very strategic, choosing walls that are dark, and choosing a lot of input media for video projection that's physical. So another focus that you'll see through this is that mix of low-tech and high-tech meeting one another, working with paper and markers as opposed to After Effects, if you can help it. We made another version that was a kind of regional version. This Kelty backpack is made for hunters. So hunters, when they go hunting, they have to put the carcass somewhere, but that backpack turns out to be really perfect for gear also, because it's very light and all the cables can come out of the sides, and this allowed us to do these kinds of projections. The MAW is projected light. We started to get more and more into how you could do a participatory projection event with a lot of live feeds, but again, without having to have a lot of infrastructure in place. So we designed an instrument that we call the story booth, which is essentially something that gives you that perfect mugshot of a person. The face came up as an interface, but it sure is true that if you can manage to get that footage into a projection event, there are a lot of narratives that can come out. And here's maybe a little demonstration of what that looks like. And I'm showing you these instruments because what we realized in the process was that these instruments could be combined and recombined with people and spaces and perspectives to create some scenarios for interaction with people that are really rich. So what I've been doing in the past year or two is to create a kind of catalog of these instruments, and also a kind of iconography of a series of recipes of how to do a projection outing with very modest means. So this is actually all analog technology. We realized at some point that computers are also very powerful and very versatile and all that, but if it's raining, what a pain in the ass, or if you don't have power. So a lot of strategies also around how to get away from the need for a lot of wiring. We used a lot of drawing as an interface because, again, a marker you can hand to anyone, even compared to text messaging or data scraping and all that stuff. It's invaluable to have this cross-cultural interface called the paper, the pencil. So the drawing case for doing these kinds of performances where there's a composite image of, generated graphics, but also drawings that are made. And here's a little demonstration of this instrument. And throughout learning a lot of lessons from the old traditions of wadang, like the Indonesian shadow puppetry theater, or karagos, the long Turkish shadow puppetry and performance theater experiments that come up again and again. And what's beautiful about those traditions is that they also embed in them a form of social commentary that actually doesn't come with After Effects. It does come with shadow puppetry. Maybe another example. We also realized at some point that the projection itself can really be optimized. That whole idea of projecting in public spaces, especially if you're not going to have a big truck and a huge setup, then the first problem you have to solve is projecting over people, because people are tall and the projector is on the ground, so something like a jib. Taking a lot of lessons from mechanical theater and stage performance, a kind of street theater. So here's a mobile theater that we created for 01. It was a new media biennial in San Jose. And the setting of this piece was the old Dadaist game of Exquisite Corpse. You've probably heard of it. It's the game where several people draw different parts of a body and then you recombine them to create these beautiful dead people. We applied that piece to the notion of martyrdom, which is something that's very central to my home country of Iran. The martyr, as I saw it in the ants, is a very beautiful poetic character. And what we did in this piece was we created a kind of mobile mechanical theater that allowed one of our performers to go around and gather drawings. So there would be a display that would show people the scale at which they should draw, but again, the interface is super low tech. It's marker on paper, and the projector is just used to not need to give any instructions to people. And then during the performance, the performer is on this side, the audience participant is on that side, and then you rely on all the mechanics of gesture and street theater and performance. So ceremonious cutting of paper and folding of paper and delivery of paper to the person who's then going to create, some sort of a more complex projection scenario. The setting in this piece was that there was an Iranian artist in Iran participating over Skype. There was an Iranian artist on site in San Jose, and then all of the other people. Those were the three components of the drawing. And again, just some of the hints about the low-tech, high-tech. There are a lot of tools for collaborative drawing and all of this on the internet, and you can make your own add-ons and open frames or whatever. But the other thing you can do is just turn on Skype, have the other people draw on marker, hold up the paper in front of the marker, press print, it comes out, you cut it with scissors, and off you go. So all of those ways of being able to move faster to get to what your intention is in these pieces. Here, this is a small video just to give you a sense of how the performance felt. So the drawings that you see in three parts, again, one part was drawn by someone on site, one part was drawn by a participant, and one part by an Iranian artist in exile out of the country. And to draw it back to where I'm headed in this talk, which is the idea of creating a manual for people that may want to do this, the secret lessons, the superpowers that we learn in these performances are what's in that manual. So for instance, the superpower of practicing, that notion of practicing that musicians know so well, the thing that happens when you do something 3 hours a day, every day for 3 years. It's really hard to put it into words without just going through the experience. But we tried to work really rough and really fast in this collective in order to practice. So in the 4 or 5 years that I worked with the group of students and artists that were a part of MAL, we probably did something like 500-600 performances in several different countries, and most of these quite low-key, most of them quite unannounced. So there are lots of beautiful anecdotes also of what happens when people, so there it is, those are the people in Iran, and they hold up the paper, and we have Skype, and all of a sudden you realize when you have an interface that includes the openness of human connection, like the telepresence of Skype, then there are actually a lot of other visual material that enter your composition that you couldn't have done, again, if you'd just gone about it from the world of drawing. A few more instruments. We were commissioned by an organization in Cairo to do some projections, and we chose the deserts of Farfalla. So there's an area about 7 hours southwest of Cairo that is well known for its geology of these insane rocks that are big and bright and in the desert and all alone. So take a pathfinder and again add some very, very minimal projection, but choose the site wisely so that your 3,000 lumen projector can create an image that's 200 feet wide. It's totally possible, but it's just a matter of developing what the metrics are that you use and the kinds of conditions that you look for. We were commissioned by the Harpo Foundation to do something with this incredible organization in North Carolina called Elsewhere. Elsewhere is this amazing museum in the city of Greensboro that's actually, it was a thrift store for 70, 80 years, and then it was turned into a museum with that entire collection of 70 years of hoarding. So over the course of 15 years, they've had many artists come and organize the space, mostly by color. So there's something like 200,000 items, dishes, clothing, books that are more or less arranged by color. And here we started to experiment with the tools of surveillance. Something happened in the last 2-3 years, and the whole world of network cameras has really come a long, long way, which is very exciting because it's a great way to work with multiple live inputs for projection, which was something of interest for us. But again, with these kinds of performances too, I was always interested in creating a physical interface for these tools. So we came up with a kind of conceptual underpinning of timekeepers and timers, the cameras and the people that keep them, and a whole lingo around what it means to take charge of surveillance and create a creative authoring tool out of it. Here's a little bit about Time Machine, so you see what it looks like and what this space was like. It begins with me entering the museum.
Artifacts for our archive elsewhere, constantly changing ones.
So this installation was actually made to help Elsewhere better archive the human exchanges that happen in this space, because there's crazy shit happening all the time in this museum because there are just so many things, and it's a space that really encourages transgressive play. So I created this kind of central sculptural thing that has a map of the space and a little bubble graphic of a camera looking at a certain place, and then right away we try to undermine all the signifiers of surveillance and make them very playful tools, starting with the sound, and so you can kind of move around and zoom in and start recording. And they also had, like many museums do, they had a whole scene with iPods and iPads and everything, so we integrated that so that everyone could be watching everyone and making animated sequences of everybody else. There are a lot of details in everything that I'm saying, so software is obviously a big part of this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about software today, but suffice it to say that we're really, really committed to contributing to the big open source frameworks that help us do this kind of thing. So there was a whole environment that we created called LiveDraw that allowed us to do that kind of live projection scenario. And over the past 2 years, we moved almost all of the bits of that over to Open Frameworks, which is an environment that you guys know. So a lot of the things that are in Open Frameworks 7 and 8 are actually the core engines from this LiveDraw. And then maybe just for the computationally minded in this room, just a quick little plug for anyone who might have an interest in this. As another part of this whole venture of software development, I've been very interested in trying to bring the world of mapping. That word came up in a few of the talks yesterday. I've been very interested in bringing up that world into, the latest and greatest of computer science from the years of 2002 to 2004, which is that world of all of the most generic and established machine learning algorithms that are everywhere we know, from Amazon to Pandora to all the great pieces, but trying to do it in a way that works for us, works for artists, so using them in the platforms that we like. And for us, that means running it in real-time environments like Pure Data or Max. Maybe some people are aware of these things. And also running them on embedded platforms. So I would be delighted to tell anyone who's interested about this more about it, but suffice it to say things like artificial neural networks, support vector machines, dynamic time warping. These are some of the algorithms that were really codified in the years 2002 to 2004 in the computer science disciplines in those in that whole domain. Whereas as a teacher, what I've seen in the last 10 years is that for many of my students and many artists, that word mapping remains limited to the scale function of the Arduino IDE, which is just a linear thing. So a few of us really are trying to push this a little further out into the early 2000s and hopefully a little bit beyond. So all of these lessons for me have now started to embody themselves under an umbrella term of the Center for Urban Intervention Research. I'll show you the full layout of what that center looks like now, but the first project of this center is to create a manual. So the Manual for Urban Projection, it's a resource that we hope to release in October of this year. And again, this is for all manners of people that would like to use urban projection but don't really have the desire or the means to deal with a production company who's going to bring in the 20K projector, and they don't want to get city permits for projecting on something. So a lot of strategies for minimizing tools, maximizing affect and impact, and starting from a very intersectional place. So thinking of urban projection as a very complex overlap of not only performance and public art, but also the meeting place of community organizing and the meeting place of urban planning. The layout of the book is as follows. There are 3 chapters to the book, and I'll give you a little bit of each of these chapters. We begin with a series of concepts, which is kind of taking the theory and practice of transgression and intervention up to date to bring it for us. A series of tools, and I'll give you the layout of those, and then a series of scenarios, and these are the recipes for how to combine the different elements of projection. And in terms of who this is for, there's a long list of people here, but it's just worth noting that many of those figures, these are not artists necessarily. So it's not, we're not trying to make the next, plug-in for some environment that artists are really used to, but we're trying to make it so that a school teacher who has a projector in the room and a bunch of kids and they take field trips, maybe they can have some strategies and help for how to do something really magical, how to create a real experience for people with the simple tools that they have. The concepts section, this is maybe about a 10-page section in the book of mostly text, deals with time update. Time update for us is really to take all of the situationist thinking that a lot of Mark's work is based on and inspired by also, and many others in the room, and try to apply that to the world today. People and Places really takes the idea of direct observation. So it's inspired by William Wyatt and what it means to go to a space and just begin by looking as a way of intervening, which is, it makes sense in retrospect, but not all art projects in public space happen like that. Thinking of light and image as really 2 counter forces, 2 forces that are of the same medium, but can function very differently. So again, in our experiments, we also found that, a floodlight can be as effective as a projector if all you need is a stenciled sign of some kind. Systems and processes. This, I have to say, I'm really inspired by a curriculum that we have in the School of Art at Carnegie Mellon. And if I could just say it in a quick summary, many schools of art, when the students, 18-year-olds, come, they take a class like Wood 1, and then they take Wood 2, and Metal 1, and Painting 2, and that would be your first couple of years. At Carnegie Mellon, we have these 4 sequence of courses that we call concept studios. The first one is Self, the Human Being. The second one is Systems and Processes. The third one is Time and Space. And the fourth one is the Social Self. So that way of thinking of systems thinking, the idea of identifying leverage points in a system and pushing them. So Donna Meadows and the systems thinking primer, some of those texts that really are actually the fundamentals of management consulting, if you think of it from the other side, but can really be applied to art and public space in very effective ways too. And then, of course, the whole world of work and play, what it means to take a space and transform it from a serious place to a playful place. The second chapter, it really starts to get nitty-gritty, and formally it actually begins to look much more like a manual. It's tabulated, and all of the different human and non-human elements that we identified in a projection event are listed, and then some advice and insight is given. So if you think of the subtleties of the projector beam, this book is coupled with an online resource through the Queer website that gives you references for what's hot to buy now, because ultimately we found that these are some of the most important obstacles that people have. People might actually have access to budgets and resources, but there's a lot of choices, and there are a lot of right and wrongs in the choices that you make in this case. And then finally the scenarios, and for the scenarios, we decided that we really wish for this book to be extremely practical. So the book is going to be a free print-on-demand thing. That's an 8.5 by 11 page, so you can photocopy it, you can fold it and photocopy it, and it comes with cutouts. And the cutouts create a very simplistic iconography of the elements that you can rearrange in space. And we worked with a brilliant designer, Matthew Rezax, who helped us create icons that can be hand-drawn with marker. So these are actually generated as brainstorming tools so that you can combine them in certain ways and create diagrams that tell you where the people go, where the projection goes, what the people see. And in this section, there are about 10 or 12 recipes, and each recipe has an instruction, like this is how you do it. It has a series of wisdoms. So for instance, this one lays out the certain scenario of drawing, and I'll show you an example in a moment. So if I could just describe the icons that are here. You don't see my mouse over there, which is unfortunate, but the monument, let's say, the thing you're projecting on is that number 6 up there. The audience members, it's indicated that they can see that, but they can also see you. I mean, this is a very simple wisdom, but once you realize that your projection performance is not just about the projection, it's also about you being in a space and performing in a space. There's a whole range of let's say, amenities that can come to you. And then that squiggly thing labeled number 1, that's that thing in between. So that's that object, that instrument that has the power to mediate some kind of interaction between you and the audience. So to give you a quick example of one of these outings, let's see what this one looks like. So this was an unoccupied wall of sorts in an area of Minneapolis, and it's really a perfect projection site because it's an unclaimed space that the community has just decided to slowly take over. So first they took one of the desire lines in that space and they made it an official path. Then they started to set up a Sunday market there, and what you see here, I wish to point out, it might seem like a kind of animation, like a prepared thing, but as the setup moves, you see that it's actually super simple. It's objects under a camera. And what we really relied on, and a lot of our software is geared towards that, is to, one, create moving image from still image, so a way of taking still images and making loops, and some smarts about syncing of loops and palindromic and this and that. And also all that has to do with transparency and depth and blending. All that stuff is very, very, very integral to creating composite images out of very simple objects. But I'll point out that if you go about projection in this way, what you do is you leverage the superpowers of your collaborators. So if your collaborators happen to be printmakers or drawers, then right away you're giving them an instrument that has kind of infinite potential. Now, there's a funny thing that happens in this video, which for me is a great exemplar of how these kinds of events can go. Another wisdom that we gained after these performances is that there is a certain amount of chaos in city spaces. And when you bring your own chaos into these spaces, and physical interfaces bring chaos, they bring a bit of chaos because there's wind, there is infinite opportunity for improvisation with these objects. And chaos meets chaos, and that's actually where your work can begin. So something quirky happens in this performance. After that, we went into a kind of live drawing session. So here, the tricks are that we use transparencies and we do drawing and, layer images on top of each other. But then as we started to do this, there was this guy, you're going to see him in a second. There was this guy who, and of course, like all of this is non-planned, right? You just set it up and people come and start doing these things. But then there was this guy who came who was starting to get really excited about the performance. Let's see if he's going to show up soon. This guy right here. So he was so excited about the performance that at some point he just, his excitement overtook him. Whoa. But here's the beautiful moment. My student David Steinman is the one with the trumpet. He just started waltzing with him. So this, again, this was an unplanned aspect of this performance, but before you know it, the waltz becomes coordinated with the animation because it's all in real time using a pen, right? So the notion of interacting with space is much more fluid. And if you notice, there's a subtle shift, but the guy actually starts to lead the dance at some point. So this, for me, is the case in point of engagement. Like this is when it actually happened for us, as opposed to someone liking something they see and saying thank you at the end. A couple of more examples, maybe. I want to show you some of the examples of these diagrams that get a bit more complex. Again, the focus here is on really keeping count of who is experiencing what the sight lines are. So the red line indicates a physical distance between certain people and certain other people. And one scenario that we experimented with was the idea of having a collective have control over a video projection. So getting away from the one-on-one interaction to a many-to-one. And here's a very simple scenario. We used a bunch of open source software. It's actually this thing called Animata from the lab in Budapest that we were speaking of with someone, Kibu. It's a really beautiful way to, again, take hand drawings and create smooth animations out of them. And then a bunch of smart machine learning in between to do scaling that's more sophisticated than just one-to-one, so that with gesture you can control these movements. And again, I think the lesson here is that people create their experience. People shape their experiences if they have tools that are open-ended. And what you see invariably in a setting like this is that people start to dance with one another without any instructions. And before you know it, the dancing is off the screen and into the street itself. There's also a suitcase projector that was in the background. And then maybe just one final diagram to show you some of the most complex ones that we've worked with. So this is actually from a performance that we did called the Battle of Everyouth. And the scenario here was, if you look to the top right, those wireless devices, those are actually the story booth device that I showed you and the drawing case device. And the scenario here was that we worked with a group of high school students for about 6 months, working on a curriculum that was about youth violence. So here, just understanding that that kind of engagement, that kind of participation from people does not develop over a week. So we had 3 teachers who actually shaped their curricula in history and in art and in science to learn about interactions between youth and global politics. And then we set up a performance where the students were interviewing people using these instruments of ours. These instruments empowered them to just go up to someone and be a bit more formal and created a kind of a performance. There was also a micro projection. That's the area at the top, and of course the large monumental projections in the bottom. I'm going to move now to the most recent project of the Center for Urban Intervention Research. It's the project that's a part of Connecting Cities, of which iMAL is a co-producer. The project is called Telepathy TV. In short, the project is about immigration, and it's about the diversity of experiences in immigration and all of the shared experiences and also the things that should be shared that are not. The premise is that there's a puppet, so it's the puppet here. And this puppet is a likeness of me. So there's a small Ali, and then I'm working with this collaborator of mine named Nima. There's also a small Nima. And what we do in this project is that the puppets learn about the memories that immigrants have from someplace back home. So we ask them 2 questions. We ask them, if you could close your eyes and appear back home, where would you go? And the second question is, what would you do? And once we gather those, the plan now is for these puppets to go to those places. So the puppets will be traveling to Iran and Morocco and Afghanistan and Palestine in the next few months to reenact these memories on site. Now, what is peculiar about the puppet is that it has a bit of augmented technology in it. Let's see if we can see in this video. So the puppets have a camera. That SLR camera is an actual camera, and the contents of that camera is streamed to the net in this extremely analog, simple way. And one of the puppets also has a screen for its face, so it can literally become someone else. They get possessed by the person whose memories they play out, and their face appears here. And these puppets now are going to travel together and create these episodes of experiences that are reenactments of real experiences. In the fall, in September and October, we'll come back to Europe and perform these experiences as a puppet show in the real life of another puppet in my likeness watching TV, and on TV is those programs. Just maybe a couple of hints about these puppets. Again, the low-tech, high-tech feature is really critical here. I work at a fairly high-tech place at Carnegie Mellon, so there's a lot of fundamental research of all kinds going on, but here we had a much simpler problem. We're going to be traveling to places that have bad internet connections, a very diverse set of hardware, so any kind of phone running any kind of anything, and probably not necessarily a lot of access to power and all those things. So the decision that we made was to actually make a setup where the puppet is all analog. So it has a camera that's analog and wirelessly analog. It sends its image over to a screen. And then I created a mechanical solution of just taking your phone and pointing it at the screen, if you understand. So the camera of your phone is just looking at that screen, and that's how you get things into the phone. And a simple way to avoid all of the locks and keys for the iOS development and the really difficult part of getting streams of video from an analog source into your phone. So just a little aside on that. And here's some more test images of the puppet's travels. So here's the puppet in Madrid. That's little Nima. The performance is going to happen on a series of media walls that are a part of the Connecting City organization. So Media Lab Prado is they own this little wall, and what we're working with is a kind of design fiction approach and how to tell the story. So what we imagine actually in these performances is the memories that these puppets are going to gather are going to paint a picture of an alternative future where the Italians are moving to Ethiopia and the French from Israel are moving to Morocco, and maybe the boats are sinking on the way over. So it's kind of a newsreel-inspired storytelling format where the memories are real as a kind of advertisement for a time in the future where immigration is going to be very different than what we know today. I'm happy to talk more about that with anyone who's here later on. And again, some of the experiences, we owe a lot to our partners here at iMAL and in Liverpool at FACT. We've been able to gather some really incredible stories. It's hard to put them into quick words, but this image here from a church that's in not so far from here called Saint Baptiste, which again, as a part of this project, we got to experience. If you have a chance, I mentioned it to a couple of people, but there's a church in town that became an Afghani refugee camp about 8 months ago, and it really is an incredible sight. If you have a moment, you should see it. It's an enormous Catholic church with tents inside for hundreds of people. So you observe these insane settings where, the Afghani guy who's there sitting and telling our stories, sitting next to a statue of Christ, but he has to leave the room at certain hours of the day because you can't be near an idol all the time, and very, very complex scenarios that we're hoping to reimagine with these puppets. And then finally, just a moment to tell you about Queer and what it is. Please take a look. It's a website that's supposed to be a resource for many of us. It's c-uir.org. And what you'll find there is a listing of all of the different projects that fall within this world of urban intervention research for me. And to mention a few that you see here, of course, the manual that I spoke of. I've done a lot of festival organizing in my time too. I used to run a music festival, and I've become really interested in night festivals. I participated in a few Nuit Blanche type events, and we're going to start one in Pittsburgh in the next 2 years, the fall of 2016. So I also see that as a part of my practice as an urban interventionist. We've become really interested in neo-bike safety. So there are a few standards in the States. DPSM is a standard that's now mandated to be in all the cars and traffic lights in the next couple of years, which is actually really interesting. It's a little chip that can tell your bike whether the traffic light is turning yellow, that kind of stuff. So we're all getting ready for self-driving cars, right? But that process of getting tapped in, again, in the environments that we're comfortable with, so the real-time environments that we use for media creation and production. I'm trying to also find ways within research that we're doing with people in electrical and computer engineering, but we want to use the bike, the smart bike, as an instrument for these kinds of interventions, and I feel that I find that as a part of this urban intervention research rubric. And of course, there's also this 5x5. There's a project that'll happen at DuPont Circle, which is this monumental place in the nation's capital, and other video projection events. But here, a roadshow, you could say, of the manual. So the next phase for the manual is to take this manual to different places and to train people with it and show people how they can do a lot with a little with video projection. Well, I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you.
So, no? Hope so.
Mark has a question.
Oh. Ali, thanks for your incredible tour of a wide range of different kinds of work that you've been engaged with over time. I've got essentially two questions, but they're related to the same, let's say, thrust of inquiry. First is, you were talking with Time Machine about, in a sense, domesticating the surveillance technologies, right? And so, question for me becomes, what's at stake when one does that? And then the second question, which is in a sense related, is what is your position vis-a-vis this kind of collaborative production of public spectacles? How would you position your approach vis-a-vis these two instances of engagement?
I understand the first question. Can you say a little bit more about the public event collaborative production? I want to understand your question a bit better.
Very simply, with the projection pieces, you've create a framework within which people come together and through these drawings produce this spectacle on a blank wall, right? These public projections at night, and I just wonder, how you see that vis-a-vis questions of engagement. You talked specifically about this one person. Who came in and ended up crashing into one of the projectors and then was sort of engaged or drawn into the performance in a particular way. But I wanted just to really give you an opportunity to kind of expand on some of the encounters and the subsequent reflection you've had about engaging the public in these different ways, right? So Time Machine in terms of domesticating surveillance technologies and the public projections vis-a-vis collaborative spectacle production.
Yeah, great questions. For Time Machine, I like that question of what is at stake. I think what's at stake is becoming desensitized to surveillance and not noticing that it plays such an important role in our life. And we use the language of absurd theater in that piece more than anything else. So we personify the cameras and we put them in the most inconspicuous places or conspicuous places, and they have hats and they have sunglasses. And right away what we try to create in that setting is that, well, if you look at the last 2-3 years, just what happened with these network cameras and all the software that's on phones, the crossover with mothers watching their babies right away came into people watching their food in the kitchen. And so there's a sensitivity to that medium now that's much more playful, right? And for me, these pieces, most of these pieces, this now relates to your second question. What I've come to learn is the success of these pieces is for me much more measurable in the conversation that's around the pieces. So for what we saw with that surveillance piece, for instance, is that I think that genuinely for the first time I heard some people, well, it was their first time, really question surveillance. Like, oh, what? There are cameras everywhere? Oh, what? We can control the cameras? Well, why can't we control the cameras everywhere if we're seeing them? So some of the most basic questions that I think are the starting point for a lot of people in this room. I find that if you bring play into the interaction, you can actually really open up those questions. As for engagement, I guess my trajectory with art practice and larger scale projects in general has changed a bit. Over the past few years, I guess I've come off my high horse a bit, and I've realized that there's a certain responsibility that comes with working in public space that we can try to undermine if it's really our intention, but with this manual and with the way that we're going about projection work, I've become much more interested in helping others use that medium. So it reminds me also of a tarot card reading that I had a few years ago, where it was this, like, the wands in the tarot cards, those are the cards that represent all of the shenanigans of life, the obstacles, the terrible things. So I was reading, I was having my tarot card reading, and at some point all of the cards were wands. I was like lost in cables and bureaucracies and all kinds of other things. And by the end of the tarot card reading, it turned into a scenario where, in the words of the reader, I had started all of these things that I was no longer a part of. And I've become more and more comfortable with that, so I think of those performances for us as a real research laboratory to develop these instruments, and ideally that instrument making is actually the work. So that's more and more where I'm headed with those works. I don't look for gigs in public projection anymore. I'm much more interested in disseminating the tremendous amount of knowledge that so many people have produced that somehow still remains inaccessible to, community organizations or art students at Carnegie Mellon. So really trying to do a very difficult job to write a manual and use no jargon, to try to use a manual, bring a manual that has no software that costs any money, to really stay on top of where the industry from entertainment is meeting public space. And maybe it's work that I should have done a long time ago, but there are parts of that manual that address the order in which you should talk to people if you're trying to do something in public space. But I guess it's like that whole engagement, like civic engagement part of that project has really taken over, as opposed to, I don't think of that work as social practice. It's more like instrument building for civic engagement. And I really like your comment about that guy. I actually feel, in retrospect, insensitive in the way that I described his engagement with our piece. And thank you for bringing that to my attention. I should be more aware of that. But it's true that some of the ways that we've made these instruments and we've made these manuals they're really geared towards creating scenarios that are open, so weird things happen. And being open to that, to really actually plan for that, is a big part of this work. And that moment in that video is an exemplar, because there was a mishap that could have gone poorly, much more poorly. There's a racial tension in that particular square also, but somehow we saw the playfulness of the instrument and the medium translate to that interaction in a way that I found really touching that time. There's a question over here.
I knew you would have a question.
I really, really loved all the projection manual works and the kind of kits, and with the low tech and high tech. I think because when you're out, and then like that, you don't need a high lumen, all the expensive projector, and you're making everything accessible. And because I also work with projection, and I recently also did a workshop for people who are not familiar with projections, and it's so. Anyway, my question is, so when you did this public projection series of public projections, where I want to know what kind of different reactions, depending on specific locations. You had mentioned briefly, but different cities, for example, different countries, how people reacted, and what your intake was after that, the feedback. How did you, what was your, insight after, on kind of different geographies using projection?
Yeah, it's a big question. So it's hard for me to summarize based on countries, but I can give a couple of anecdotes that have, for me, been really telling. I think of one where we were doing a performance at a very prominent street corner in the city of Minneapolis, and it was generally our policy with these performances that we don't ask for permission, we ask for forgiveness. This came up and Mark mentioned it also. But over the years of practice, we have developed a rapport or kind of house rules of what to do with authority. And during this particular performance, we get to this spot and we start projecting this piece by a student of mine named Khadija Stewart that was about lost things. So she'd gone around town and picked up these things that people have lost and labeled them and then created a kind of animation. It was very charming. There was a map and little things with name tags and whatnot. And we're projecting this, and the cops come, and the cops are like, what are you doing? You can't project here. And we say, why can't we project here? And he says, well, this is America, and this guy owns the sidewalk, and you're standing on it. And as we were doing this, my students had actually taken on that kind of social practice twist. So the animation was on the right, and on the left-hand side, again, the low-tech, high-tech, they just opened a Photoshop document, and they were typing, right? White background, black text, they were typing. And as I'm trying to convince this cop that what we're doing is okay and legit, the guy, one of my students, types up there, I've lost everything I have and I feel great. So at this moment, the cop notices that, he just cuts me off, he turns to his partner and he says, man, that's what Pat was saying the other day. He lost everything he had and he's like the best he's ever done. So it's these moments that become memorable for me, and the only reason that happened was because of everyone's openness to engage in that moment. So I don't know, like that's when the light bulb says, oh, this is what it looks like when you actually engage people, because there I was giving him my bullshit explanation of being a college professor for a public university, and he was actually engaging with the text of the work through a relationship he had with his friend. So there are countless examples like that. Maybe a counterexample to that is that I found the larger scale these events get, like the more produced they are and the more bodies are involved and the bigger the name of the institution, the harder it becomes to create those opportunities for someone being genuinely surprised or genuinely like taken back by something they experienced. So that's become an interesting play for me, a parameter that you can work with very proactively, like how small to keep it so that it can become big.
Okay, yeah, great talk, thanks. You've inspired me to kind of revive a live drawing project that I'd left dormant for a while. I was just thinking back to your interest in dynamic systems, and then also you were talking about setting up a kind of projection systems that were a bit more distributed instead of just a kind of a one position, one author kind of thing. How's that been different when you've done that, and how's it been different when you've had distributed projection systems, and what's emerged from that that's just been different to the one projector?
Yeah, well, it's a bit like that parameter that we discovered of the overall size of the thing. Over the range of the practices, we also discovered that superpower of not needing a computer or a big projector. So you've actually kind of hit the nail on the spot. The place we're working now for that night festival in Pittsburgh that we want to prepare is to create a kind of buoy projector system. So this would be a very robust box with something like a Udo in it that's like a better Raspberry Pi. So embedded systems that can run a projector on their own. And for me, that's a really, really exciting place to be. The idea of embedding the computation for the video source in the projector. We've done some experiments with that, with projection from phones and whatnot. Is this what you're asking about, that way of distributing the hardware? Or?
Kind of, but more when it's been, if you've had a system where maybe half a dozen or a dozen people can be drawing at once and inputting, in parallel to one projection, how has that changed the kind of the animation that's been made, and have there been any different social behaviours from that?
Yeah, I understand. Maybe the question is a bit more about the content also. We've done a couple of different ways of doing that. One of them has been to use sensors, distributed sensors, so several people are affecting one thing, and another has been to use text. So we've actually we've found that to be very effective. There are many examples now of situations where text messaging is translated to projection, but we've also used that whole world of drawing as a multi-person input interface. So if you have a scenario where one camera can look at a big space and then you can hold things under it. And what I find is really a lot of the lessons are in theater. in how you conduct a situation like that. And what I found is that the feng shui of the space is incredibly important. Attention to where you sit and what you see as you try to explain to someone what's happening is very important. And some of the metrics, again, for success in our pieces have become, we have a lot of pieces that begin with a kind of expert performer. So let's say like there's some controller and someone knows how to use it, but in the best of those performances, by the end of the night, it's all other people that are doing it. They're doing the teaching, they're doing the learning, and at some point we even step away from the computer because, you know, interfaces are getting better and better. So I guess what I'm saying is that I've become really interested in how to distribute even the management of the performance itself, how to get that out of my hands. Maybe it's the tarot card reading that's coming back again. But how to really make it so that objects explain themselves, you know, all the lessons of affordance, and how to be sensitive to the fact that controllers, you know, Michael Lee and Bill Buxton really laid it out nicely. Controllers have a physical component and a cognitive component and a social component, right? So if you give someone a pen, the social component of that is very different than an iPhone, right? And realizing that that's about legibility. And so, yeah, you've, I think, pointed to a very, very rich area for us to work at. And my solutions have tended to be, the ones that I like and I'm interested in are the ones that tend to leverage mechanical intelligence, gestural intelligence, simple lighting intelligence, so all of the cues of theater, really. Partly also because I work with a lot of theater people, and they really come at it from that angle, obviously, from their training.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for navigating us through all these very inspiring projects. I have a question that maybe is related to what you were saying right now, and it's that as you're working with so many different people, like you're working with students, you're working with technicians, you're working with all these different expertise and roles, do you find you have the need, you need, or in the process, do you need to kind of do a training or sensitizing or briefing that gets people in a certain either mindset or that to acquire a certain set of skills that allows for the things to happen a certain way? Because I find that the thing that, I mean, you're showing more or less like how the things came out the end, but I know that in the planning for sure that was kind of difficult thing, how to get people in the right kind of mindset or role or to develop their own skills, like what you said, in some point you just step back, but to achieve that's, I think it's complicated. So I want to know what's your view on it, also being a teacher and seeing it from the point of sensitizing maybe students or training students on doing so.
Yeah. Maybe I can use the reference of, it might be, if you don't know it, it might be interesting for you to look up. There is a partnership called Stone Yamashita. They're the ones who advised IBM to get out of the hardware business, and they're the ones who advised Starbucks to become the good coffee shop. And Keith Yamashita, who's one of the partners in that, has this really beautiful argument he makes about superpowers that I've started to really think about a lot. And the idea is that in a good team, everybody has a superpower. And in the best of teams, most people are expressing mostly their superpower most of the time. So do you understand what I mean? So it starts with identifying what people are good at. It continues with creating contexts where those things can be sufficient, right? And then on the side, of course, there's a lot of learning. Even the person who's good at drawing can learn something about software. But what I find again and again in these heavily collaborative interdisciplinary media, like urban projection, heavily collaborative, it has to be. It's really difficult to do this kind of thing alone, is that you have to find a way for each person to really do the thing that they're really good at. So concretely, what that has driven us towards is working with traditional media, number one. It's driven us towards working with existing communities that are really strong and already have their own code and resource. So that could either be the bike community, right? Or it could be the Afghani refugee community, right? So in some ways, not to try to invent any of these things on its own in the work, but find the right situation for it. In the software, for instance, it's turned out to be, it took me a long time to admit this to myself, but one good developer can do more damage in one day than 10 okay developers over 10 years. So in lieu of trying to get everyone to be a better developer, find the superpowers and sit the people that are interested next to the superpower developer And for years and years in these projects, that was me, but now more and more there are other people that are involved, and the whole world of GitHub has come a long way in the last 5 years. And so, I would point you to a great TEDx talk that he has also about superpowers. There's actually a game that Stone Yamashita developed that you play with playing cards as a team building tool, and it allows each person to identify their own superpower through a series of questions that are formulated like, your friends go camping, they need to start a fire, they're going to call you, right? So it's lots of questions like that you choose pairwise in between, and I actually do stuff like that in class. So when we begin, I usually start by making a big map of all the things you have to know about if you're going to do this right, and it's a lot. It's a lot. You have to know about software, you have to know about projection mapping, you have to know how to deal with authority, you have to probably know a second language in a lot of places, and then we try to see who wants to be where in those situations, as opposed to creating that perfect flat hierarchy of everyone is everything. And then, of course, that it's a double-edged sword. There's always that situation you can get into where there's the artist and the engineer, and the artist is supposed to be creative, but in some ways that's a big problem to tackle that I think a lot of us are working on, to how to work with in bimodal classrooms where there are two different skills that people are good at. But I think it can be very empowering to identify these skills and call them superpowers, like to people's face, in front of other people, especially with young students. You'd be amazed. It makes a huge difference to say, whoa, shit, that is your superpower. Sit there and do that, right? And then someone else realizes, oh, well, I actually do a different thing that could be very powerful.
Can I complement something? I think that answers perfectly the question, and I see it very related to skills, or how you call it, superpowers, and then maybe in the sense of sensitizing people of working with the public. Do you find, like for example, students, are they already sensitized with working with the public space or with the public and engaging in this way, or do you find necessary somehow to also do some kind of process, as with the powers, with the sensitizing with working with public?
Yeah, for that too, I guess I have a lot of respect for some forms of social practice where the artist really wears that hat also, but there too, I've started to really find my own place, like not try to do everything, and I've started to really value cultural partners who take that whole engagement thing seriously. And what I find for students actually is when you introduce them to a liaison like that with the public, you gain a great advantage. The first thing you gain is that you're conveying to the students dealing with real people is a big deal. You don't just get up tomorrow and decide you're going to change this community because you can. You start by asking the people that have been trying to do it for 20 years, right? So as an example, in iMAL, the first thing that they did in order to help us make the Telepuppet project is they found someone who lives down the street who really knows that community, and then it's like night and day. Going around with that person is like everywhere you go, you have a friend. So in the classroom too, I've found that when it comes to dealing with real people, I've come to really be appreciative of bureaucracy. I know it sounds ridiculous, but people that take that seriously and actually say, if you're going to interview people, there should be someone else in the room. Always. Great. Yeah, let's have someone else in the room. And I love to have people like that around that can actually play that role for my students. That's not my role, but I value it enough to know that you actually need that person in an equation like this. If you're going to do something that's lasting, right? If you're really going to get a community organization to consider urban projection as one of their media, then you need a real partner on that side, as opposed to just showing up and doing a workshop one day and maybe another one next year. So, yeah, really relying on existing structures and respecting all the boring parts of it and all of the less boring parts of it. And I'm just getting older, I guess. I've come to see the real value of that.